Welcome to another episode of the Chronic Comeback podcast. This week, I'm really excited to have on the show Lindsay Mitchell. Lindsay's story of chronic illness began when she was a teenager, when she tested positive for EBV while studying to be a physician in South America. She fell ill to various parasites that kept her fatigued with gut issues after returning to the US. And actually, during a trip, she received a tick bite, which unleashed the perfect storm, something her and I were just talking about before this episode, a buildup of biological and environmental toxins due to years of exposure. She ended up testing positive for Lyme disease, multiple parasites, and a number of other co-infections. Her doctors at this point told her to get comfortable and just basically prepare her to live with it. But this is something she rejected. And this is the kind of story that I love. She began reading about brain's ability to change and actually the ability to be able to retrain your brain. Once she began to master this process and learn how to calm the stress response, her symptoms didn't only improve, they began to disappear. And within 8 months, she was totally better. Fast forward to 2018, and Lindsay founded Vital Side, a neuroplasticity, I knew I would struggle with that word, based healing program that helps chronically ill or stressed people go from fight, flight, or freeze, and to rest and digest. This is a really exciting subject for me personally to talk about, because I was just talking to Lindsay before we started the episode. It's something that I've only realized, 10 years into my journey, I've only realized how important, and in fact, it could be the key thing that is stopping me from recovering. And so I'm really excited to get into it. I'll stop talking now. How are you?
Thank you, Phil. Yes, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me and for sharing these wonderful, positive stories of recovery. It's just really inspiring.
No worries. And thanks so much for coming on. So, right, let's go back to the beginning. I hopefully got most of those details correct. But before you started to get any sort of health issues, like what was your health life? Were you like a sickly child? Were you healthy growing up? Like, what was your health like in general?
Well, it's interesting because I think everybody with a chronic illness or who has had a chronic illness does this. They go back and they trace the events of their life that could have brought them to this place of that perfect storm, like you described, the, environmental, biological, emotional, toxic buildup. And so when I received that diagnosis of Lyme disease, that's exactly what I did. And so I pinpointed certain points in my life where I was like, oh, I was diagnosed with Epstein-Barr when I was 13. Rewind further back and, experienced trauma as an 8-year-old child and experienced about a year of that trauma. And ever since that time, I had been sort of sick on and off. I was never a well child. And so diagnosed with Epstein-Barr as 13-year-old, I always went to therapy and I always kind of did used processing tools to kind of address that trauma. And then I moved around a lot after that. But I think my primary response was being in this state of fight or flight, because this is that survival protective mechanism that everybody has. But I think that became my primary go-to response. So that does impact your immune system. And I did get sick a lot and I was tired a lot. And so I wasn't physically a very well child, but because of the work that I was doing in therapy, I've always been a very, very happy person. So I was happy and things seemed like they were going well. And when I, went to PA school and college, and I lived a very full life, but my health was always impacted. And that to me was kind of how that fight or flight response showed up in my body, as kind of being consistently immunosuppressed.
Okay. And so could you take us through so you were, I guess, on and off sick, but nothing that was so extreme that made you think, oh, I need to go and get this seen to. at what point was it after you received, you got the tick bite, and could you talk us through that part of the story?
Yeah. So I was pretty happy, well, physically, not so much. Ended up, like you mentioned in my story, getting some parasites when I was just doing some traveling, working as a travel PA, worked in really rural environments, was exposed to, water damaged houses and parasites and things like that. And then I got to this place where I was doing some traveling, bitten by the tick, and then boom, that became my perfect storm. So I think about it and I look back at it in this place where I'm connecting the dots, like from the trauma I experienced as a child to all of the events in between, and never being, treated in a holistic way, and then getting to the point where I was bitten by the tick. And at that point, my body just gave up. My body was basically saying to me, like, I can't deal with this anymore. I was getting daily migraines, joint pain, fatigue. And at the time I was traveling, so I kind of thought it was jet lag. And I'm, a practitioner. So of course I'm not thinking, I'm like, oh, it's jet lag, I'll be okay. Take some ibuprofen, shake it off. And did that for about 6 months, until it became unbearable. And I was traveling around the world at the time with my now husband, and we had gotten to Virginia, and we were mountain biking. Well, tried to mountain bike, but the joint pain was so bad. And at one point I was just crying, and I was kind of carrying my mountain bike and or rolling it. And it was just so much pain. And we came home, and we were back to the house we were staying at in Virginia, and he had a tick on him, and he like flicked it off, and he was like, oh, remember when you were bitten by the tick about 6 months ago? And I was like, oh my goodness, like, how did I not see this? So being in Virginia at the time, I immediately went to the doctor, immediately got tested. We ended up moving to Austin, Texas, and immediately began treating Lyme. And I tried the kind of more Western approach, because that's my medical training, and did that for a while. Didn't see changes to my symptoms. It was a really disempowering process, being told time after time that, okay, well, yeah, you just have to make yourself comfortable and deal with this. You'll probably always live like this. I was also told, well, you're a woman and you're, in your mid-20s. You're probably just tired, or it's hormonal, and you'll get better. So, the whole shebang, like a lot of us have heard. It's really kind of, unfortunately, as patients, we are, we deal with that. We deal with the medical trauma. And so I dealt with that. And then I very quickly realized that there was a more holistic approach. So tried all of the different modalities, then expanded, my comfort zone, and tried a more Eastern approach, and so many different healing tools along the way. And a lot of it made me really comfortable and really helped. And, of course, they're the things like, getting more familiar with non-toxic products and organic eating and all of these things that came along with it. But I was still sick. I was still symptomatic. I was still in pain every day, still couldn't work, was bedbound for about 3 months. And I knew there was something else. I was like, I'm missing something. There's like this missing puzzle piece. And that is when I read about how the brain changes when you have a chronic illness. And that just made so much sense to me, because I had done all of the physical things. I have extended at that point all of my resources, but I was still sick and I was still symptomatic. There was this missing puzzle piece of, but why can't I get better? Why isn't my body responding? I'm still hyperinflamed. I'm still hypersensitive. I'm still hypervigilant. What's going on here? So I started reading about how the brain changes when you have a chronic condition and can get stuck in this chronic state of fight or flight, or these survival responses trying to protect you because there was danger there, right? There was that bacteria or parasitic infection or whatever it was, and your body was trying to fight it off. So cue fight or flight. But what happens to the brain, and because the brain is so malleable, it can get stuck in this chronic state of fight or flight. So that if we take all the medications and all the supplements and eat all the right foods and do all the, so-called right things, our brains can still be responding like there is danger present, and continues to tell the body that danger is present. And so you'll see that in our hormone production. You'll see that in your cortisol, adrenaline production, these stress hormones. You'll see that in the way that your body experiences inflammation in the form of pain or rashes or hypersensitivity. And I just started to kind of deep dive into this information and do all the research and read all the books and find out some key players in the neuroplasticity world, because when you delve into it, oh my goodness, there's so much information out there. And I immediately signed up for any program that was offering kind of this brain retraining, style to healing chronic conditions. And I started to see changes after a couple of weeks, and took these kind of mental exercises that I was learning from the programs and started to do more research, read Dr. Candace Pert's Molecules of Emotion, studied Dr. Joe Dispenza's work and Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, and learning additional modalities and delving into the research conducted by Dr. Norman Deutsch, and figuring out tools and techniques that worked for me. And it was incredible to see the shifts. I first started to notice I was less reactive to my environment. I remember just a couple weeks after I had started to implement these mental exercises and kind of shift out of this fight or flight response. I live in Texas. I went to a neighbor's crawfish broil that they were having in their backyard. And I hadn't been to a social event in months and months. And I was there. And I was there for about half an hour. And I wasn't reacting to my environment. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't hypervigilant. And I was there for half an hour. And I remember having that thought of, okay, whoa, like I'm here and I'm not reactive and I'm doing well. And okay, this is great. I'm going to go home before this changes. And that was like my first kind of insight into I can shift this response, which shifts my physical body and how I feel. And that is pretty freaking cool. So I started to commit all my time to this. I mean, at this point, I was taking about 80 supplements a day. I was living my life based on my appointment schedule. I didn't want to do that. And I like to say I've always been a very independent person. And I think a little bit of that also makes me a little bit of a stubborn person. I'm like, I don't want to live this life. I can't see myself living this way forever. So I'm going to do everything I possibly can to change and to prove all of those people wrong, and to know that I can make something of this. I can maybe even use what I've learned to help people, like what you've done, Bill. And I think it's just so wonderful to like see at least a little bit of like a glimmer of hope of maybe I can turn this some way, somehow into purpose, even if it's just a story I later share with people. So the drive for me was there. And then I started to see that evidence for change. And I just went head first. And I was like, I'm going to use these mental exercises daily. I'm going to devote pretty much all my time to this. I don't want to be on these supplements. I don't want to be, living my life based on my symptoms. So I spent the next, 8 months consistently, daily, using these mental exercises, learning more on my own. During this time, as I started to kind of dissipate that brain fog I was experiencing, I started a neuro-linguistic programming course, started to become trained in that, and just put all of my effort into it. And yeah, about at that 8-month mark, it took me about 8 months to a year to really wake up in the morning and breathe deeply and live my life and do the things I want to do. But I did I love to travel, and I went to Costa Rica and I went surfing, and I had a piece of full gluten, full dairy pizza. I had an alcoholic drink, which I never thought I'd be able to drink again. And all of these things I did without having a reaction. And that to me was like, okay, this is what works. This is what's going to take me to my full recovery. And I am going to get fully better. And I did. And I had made so many connections within the brain retraining community just throughout my recovery time. And so I kind of naturally started coaching people just after I had finished my NLP course. And I was going to go back into medicine and work with an integrative doctor in town. But at that point, I recognized so much of the healing power that we have within ourselves. And medical practitioners don't talk about it. A lot of people don't talk about it and don't recognize it. And we outsource a lot of our healing to other people. So I thought, well, what if I could help people become aware of the natural healing properties they have within their own brains, that communication between the brain and the body. And I really started to, implement this as a healing tool. And so that's what I did. One of the first places I went to were medical offices, because as a PA, I could really easily explain, hey, this is this brain-body connection. And using a tool like this, in addition to addressing the physical body and changing your diet and changing lifestyle and all of the things they talk about there, passive forms of neuroplasticity too can be helpful. But having this combination approach, this symbiotic approach, where then the person becomes unstoppable and can recover. And that's what I started doing. And that was about 4 years ago. And, I absolutely love it. So now I have my business Vital Side. I have a fully virtual business where I work with people all over the world who have chronic conditions, but I also have a 5-day course where people can learn the science and then the tools, the very interactive, fully immersive tools to start shifting and changing that communication of survival, fight, or flight from the brain to the body so that they can see changes in their symptoms. And it has been this wild ride, and I'm so in love with what I do. And it's almost every day that I have tears of joy with what I do. I absolutely love it.
That is amazing. I have so many questions. Yeah, you might just take a drink because I've just got so many questions. First of all, just so I can understand a little bit more, your background. What were you training to be originally? Sorry, or what were you qualified in originally?
Yeah, so they don't have this position in London.
Right.
Physician assistant is something that I am. That's my certification. So it's basically like a condensed version of medical school after college.
Right.
So I graduated with a biology degree and then got my master's in physician assistant studies. And so it's basically a job where you prescribe medication, you diagnose patients, you do all of those things. But you don't have as much training and school time as a medical doctor.
Yeah.
So that's what I was working as, and I was a travel PA at the time.
It's just, yeah, I just wanted to just, yeah, it's interesting that you come from that medical background, and I like speaking to people. When I've had a few practitioners on the show, and a couple of them have been from a medical background and then kind of had to come over to the other side, and it's really interesting hearing about that story. And just with the time frames that you were working with, did you say you were in your mid-20s, or could you, wasn't clear on when it was specifically, like in terms of how many years, when you first got really sick, you were, I think you said you were with your husband mountain biking to the point where you found out about brain retraining. What was the time frames there?
It all happened very fast.
Okay.
So I was like bitten by the tick. 6 months later, got the diagnosis, and then started treatment and everything right away. So it was really a year of, well, it was longer than a year that I had discovered. It was like 6 months after the diagnosis that I had discovered brain retraining.
Right.
So it transpired very fast. And I do feel like one of the lucky ones, because at the time I had symptoms for 6 months and didn't know what the heck was going on. I think so many people have experienced that for years and years. I had a client I worked with the other day, 47 years of being sick. So for me, it was about 6 months until I got that diagnosis, and then another 6 months until I kind of discovered brain retraining. And so it happened very, very fast. But I'm like you, I'm like a 0 to 100 person. So I'm like, okay, well, I've got this disease. Let me do something about it. Let me do all of the things. And I just like flooded and did all at once, which, may not have been the best approach, but it was my approach because that's how I am. And I took the same kind of gung-ho approach to brain retraining as well.
No, that's it. I think it's interesting to hear, and that was what was going to be my next question, and that's why I wanted to hear about the time frames, just because, I often hear, particularly with Lyme disease, if you catch it earlier, you've got a better chance or whatever. But it sounds like actually when you tried to treat it, normally it didn't really respond. It was only the brain retraining when it actually started to move the needle. Do you think that with brain retraining, it matters how, well, I assume it must do, it matters how long you've had the condition, because you've got more years of toxic thinking to undo. Is that right?
It's interesting because I don't necessarily know if that's true. And I would like to study this just based on the members that I've worked with, the clients that I've worked with. Because when I started, of course, I had only had symptoms of Lyme for 6 months, but I had been stuck in this pattern of fight or flight since I was a little kid, since I was 8 years old. So, it doesn't mean that it showed up in the same ways that I did have Lyme, but when I did have Lyme, it was this exacerbated fight or flight response, and I needed to turn that off to get better. So it is really hard to kind of label or like quantify how much time you have been stuck in that fight or flight response, and it doesn't start the day that you are given your diagnosis. So it differs, but especially in this past year, having worked with a lot of people with long COVID, they seem to get fast results. And I don't think it's as much related to how long you've had the disease process. I think it's more so related to the level of commitment and time you put in. Because you think about it and you think about how many years you've kind of dealt with these autonomic nervous system responses, and then all of the beliefs and the thoughts that kind of play into that. And you have trained to get to this point where that fight or flight response is on repeat. Now that you're aware of that, and now that you're choosing to shift that, it takes time and patience and persistence to shift that daily. So if you have that time and you can commit that time, daily to shifting, you can see changes very fast. But I think every single person is different, and there are so many factors to take into consideration when thinking about it. And I think it just all comes down to the individual level of desire, and then how much time you're like, let's do this. How much time am I going to commit to using the techniques?
I think you said something that resonated with me. You said, I think it's medical trauma that you said, and I think those are the words you used, and that was like, oh wow, that is actually what it is when you have a chronic illness, and you that first time where a doctor says to you, this is something you're going to have to live with, and the first time you read a story where it says incurable, all of that is like little bits of trauma. And I just thought that was I never really thought about it like that. But I think from the day I started to get symptoms, new like neural pathways, or I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but new ways of thinking were just starting to get built in my brain, literally from that day. And I guess I never really thought about it like that. And it was actually, I think, you talked about, the fight or flight thing. And one of the first symptoms I started to realize was that literally the smallest, and it still happens now, the smallest sounds, like I'll be sitting next to my girlfriend on the sofa, and she'll say something just very, very quietly, and I will jump out my skin. And it's just, that's just not normal. And is that as a result of all of these negative negative thoughts over the years, building up and building this kind of like new way of thinking? Is that what it is?
So there's a fine line here. And I think that this is kind of where some people can get confused, because a lot of people think, no, I have a chronic condition, right? I have Lyme disease. What is the brain's role in all of this? Well, the fight or flight response turns on as a result of trying to protect you. Danger is in your body. Gotta respond, gotta fight, right? We're mammals, we're designed to survive. So we do survive. And, our heart beats faster, we start to breathe faster, blood gets sent to our hands and feet away from our guts, because digesting isn't important when we're being chased by a tiger. Survival is. What do we do to get out of this threatening kind of experience that we're going through? And what happens is when you have a chronic condition, or you have a virus or bacterial infection, or you have experienced trauma, like medical trauma, that response can remain turned on. So like you're living with that feeling of that tiger chasing you all the time. So additional experiences can feed that response. When we go to the doctor and get told, well, there's nothing we can do for you, it's really all in your head. Or we turn on the news and there's crazy news about the pandemic, and we feel that stress. So there are events and external situations that can impact that. And as a result, you'll have that fight or flight response on repeat, that negative feedback loop. And it's the same with thoughts, right? So when we have discouraging, I know you've experienced this yourself, when you've had discouraging or negative thoughts, it can make you feel worse. I think a lot of us know that. Or when we scroll on Instagram, and it's kind of these things popping up about how you look, and really skinny people, or a fad diet or something like that. And it can make you feel, very insecure. So there are these kind of very tangible examples of how we see things and we experience events and how they make us feel. So when we are kind of already stuck in that state of fight or flight, yes, our thoughts can impact how we feel and can feed that response. Situations, the choices we make, all of that can feed that response. But I guess what I want to be clear about is that it's not your fault. It's the autonomic nervous system's responses that are at play here. And for one reason or another, this fight or flight or even that freeze response turned on as a result to protect you and to help you survive. But then it stayed on. So at this point, it's almost like, oh, thank you, survival response, for staying on this long. Like, you have been trying to protect me. But at this point in time, it is not helpful, because I cannot survive every single day. We're not designed to run away from tigers 24/7. We need those periods where we can rest and digest and grow and repair and evolve and metabolize and really, sleep well, and all of these things, breathe easily, that come along with that. And we need to thrive. So what I do in particular is breaking that cycle of that survival response so that you can thrive and your body can learn how to thrive and do it on its own.
Yeah. Do you think that I think I spoke to you before we started recording about that I tried the Gupta program for a little while, and the thing I struggled with that was just because, and because I was speaking to other people, he has this community, and a lot of these people had been, in a worse situation than me, and that they actually weren't working, and they were like bed bound and stuff. So all they had to do all day was just literally focus on this. And because I've got like work and stuff like that, it was like I was almost trying to, like, I could do the bit at the beginning of the day, and then I remembered it was like meant to be like, as soon as you have a thought, come into your mind, you've got to go and do this exercise. And I was like, I can't keep going and doing this while I'm working. It was like, even that in itself was like kind of stressing me out. Do you find that people who are trying to do this work, the ones that are still trying to work and they've got other stuff on the go, is it more difficult for them than the people that can just literally it's all they've got to do?
Again, I think it depends on the individual, but I'm with you. I think kind of the levels of anxiety that somebody can experience when you're told, no, you have to pay attention to every single thought, it can be very overwhelming. So there are different approaches, and that's why, I'm grateful that there are different programs offered out there. So like, I love quick tools you can use in the moment. And I think about it in this way of, rather than kind of catching yourself have the thought, you can do that, but that takes a lot of mindfulness, a lot of awareness. And when you're working or you have kids or whatever, it can be very hard to do. So even if you just schedule those things kind of a couple times throughout the day, even 3 times throughout the day, to break that cycle, I think that is really important. So there is that time commitment that does come into play, and it may require you to wake up half an hour earlier in the morning, and then have half an hour to yourself at night, and then kind of use little tools throughout the day. But I have worked with students, I have worked with, parents who are very busy. You have to take time for yourself to commit to these protocols, but it doesn't have to be an every single moment, every single thought kind of thing. And again, I think learning style, comes into play a lot with what protocols you gravitate toward. So I think for me, I see kind of 3 learning styles pretty consistently, which is a visual learner, physical or kinesthetic learner, and auditory learner. And for example, if you're simply listening to a meditation and that's not really captivating you, and you're like, I don't know if this works for me, you may not be an auditory learner, and that learning style may not be the best for you. So in Vital Sight, I give you a couple different tools so that if you do gravitate toward one learning style, then you can use that tool again and again and again. And so I'm a physical learner. So I'm kinesthetic. You see me using my hands. I like to be an all immersive experience kind of person. So knowing that, instead of kind of maybe stopping and understanding I have this thought and writing something down, I have to actually stand up or go to the other room or do something where I'm physically involved and I may be moving a little bit. And even if it's in the chair, but there is that physical component. So if one tool didn't work for you, or you found that hard to like kind of break up your day, it may just be you need a little bit of a shift to a little bit of an understanding to your learning style, a little bit of shift in the protocol to make it more immersive and more fun for you to be like, oh no, I like moving around. I like doing this other thing. I like writing or whatever it is that kind of makes sense to you and your learning style.
And so is it your view that, so I'm going to use me as an example because no one else is here, so I'm going to be selfish. So I've got issues with like mold. I've trying to think if there's like any like that's the main, let's say that's the main issue. And at the moment the place I'm living in, whilst it's a lot better than it was, I've had it tested and it's still not perfect. It's still got mold in, but I don't think I'm not like a hyper sensitive person. I don't walk into the room and immediately, break down. I maybe a bit sneezy and stuff like that. But so I've definitely have a reaction, but not like a big reaction. I think it's more that it's just built up over years and years, but it's still there, right? Could I use brain retraining to, I could still live in this place where there is still some mold, but I can reduce the fight or flight reaction response so much that actually my body kind of like almost reboots and can deal living within this environment more. Would that be accurate or no?
So the first question I would ask you or anyone is, close your eyes. Is your environment safe? Do you deem your environment safe? Is that your perspective?
Well, right now, probably no, because I've had it tested. But I guess before I didn't know I had issues with mold, I was living in a moldy apartment, far worse than this. And I would have probably said, yeah, I was living in a safe environment, but maybe I didn't feel safe, like on a deeper level. Is that what you mean?
So there's a couple different, because you already described the physical environment and how there's a little bit of mold, but it's not super toxic. So I kind of wanted to hear from your perspective if you thought it was safe. So there are levels of safety, right? You can stay in an abusive relationship and say, yeah, I'm safe, but it's not a safe situation. So there are a couple perspectives, but you kind of want to make sure that you deem it safe from your perspective. And then from kind of an outsider's perspective, it also appears safe and feels safe and is non-toxic kind of thing. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if you deem that your environment is safe, then using tools that help you to connect with that safety resilient response is going to be really beneficial. If you don't deem your apartment safe, whether that's your perspective or the actual mold levels in your apartment, then it is going to be harder to do, but it's not impossible. And so, I've worked with a lot of people who say, I'm in a relationship where I'm not supported, or my house has kind of low levels of mold. What do I do? Can I use these tools? And so if that's the case, you absolutely can. And I recommend kind of carving out maybe a corner of your apartment where maybe you've got like an air purifier and you've got some other things that make you feel good in the apartment, or crystals, or kind of whatever you're into, fresh flowers or plants or whatever. And that's the area that you practice in. So that's where you use your tools again and again. And you can use them also throughout, the day while you're out and about as well, but in your apartment specifically. So first, if you're not feeling safe, or if this, or if the situation is unsafe, try the best you can to remove yourself from that situation or find a safe space. And if you absolutely can't, how can I do my best to bring safety to this situation and to find a way where my association has changed to how I perceive the apartment?
And so when you got to the point where you didn't have any symptoms anymore, did you retest for Lyme? Did you test for all of those things you had before? And were you clear if you did, or did you just think, I don't have any symptoms, so I don't need to?
I didn't retest. The way that I look at it, and it's different for everyone, so I'm not going to make a medical recommendation, but the way that I personally look at it is, yes, I tested positive for some things, right? So for some bacteria, for some viruses. But if you tested everybody in this world, I read a statistic one time that over 80% of people have some sort of Lyme bacteria, are walking around with it. But how many of those people are symptomatic? A lot less. And I have personally come up with a good balance of taking care of myself, taking care of my physical body, but also understanding that I'm human and I will have human experiences and, can get colds and do all of these things and break a foot or whatever it is. And so that's how I kind of live my life. So at this point, having not had symptoms for years, I did have a period where right after I kind of started to feel better and consistently didn't have symptoms for months. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go test myself. And I did every physical thing possible. I jumped out of a plane. I walked across hot coals. I did all this stuff. I was like, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to see how I feel. And it was kind of like, that was my test. That was like my personal test, was like, can I do this? I'm going to take solo trips. I'm going to camp. I'm going to do all this stuff. And I did. And I spent about a year doing that. And then at the end of the year, I was like, okay, I did that. I'm good now. Like, I don't feel the need to jump off stuff. I've kind of proved to myself. So it wouldn't be important to me to get retested because I know that I am healthy. And of course I do the kind of regular tests, but I have to be honest too, I have had to work through a lot of that medical trauma, and that's not all gone. And I think it's important to trust your practitioners, but I think it's also important to know a number, a value, a positive test. You have the ability to interpret that how you want to. And that's how I feel now. And honestly, I make up my own mind. And part of that, yes, is because I have the training in medicine. So I feel more comfortable doing that. But I also think that every single person, patient, whoever you are, should be empowered to make up their own minds when it comes to their health. And we all have the individual right to do that, to get a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth opinion, to do your own research, to figure out what works for you. Because some diets are great and some treatments are really wonderful, but we're not one size fits all people. We are very individual. And I think having that approach and knowing that you are different and your story is different, it kind of makes us all very unique and helps us to understand what works for the person, right? And that's just what works for me.
It's interesting what you said about most people had some kind of Lyme bacteria. I remember reading something, and there was like a study done of these workers somewhere in like I think they were like lumberjacks or something like that in Europe, and they tested in a place where there would be a lot of ticks, and they were all, the majority of them were outwardly healthy, and they tested them, and I think something stupid like 75% of them had Lyme, but they just did, they had no symptoms because they actually were healthy. They had that bacteria. So I think that's, it's interesting that, and I think it's almost like, I guess with with COVID at the moment, people are having COVID, but they've got the virus, but they're not showing any symptoms, which is also interesting. Going back to like the time where you got the diagnosis and you were bedbound and you were in that really difficult time, like how did you like keep going in those times? Because people can lose years of their lives in that time. They could be in a situation where they give up hope for a little bit, and they go down the wrong path. They get really discouraged, and before they know it, it's I've spoken to people on this podcast who've been in a room for like 5 or 6 years. How did you like keep yourself going and keep yourself positive? Like how did you do that?
Well, I didn't always do that. I didn't always do that. And especially before I kind of learned about brain retraining, I mean, I had that moment where it was like, 3:00 in the morning. I was lying on the floor. I was having hallucinations, like, really neurological symptoms, and I was crying, and I just wanted to die. And I said it, and I believed it in that moment. And I think a lot of people have experienced that. If you have had a chronic condition and have experienced pain or hallucinations or something so intensely. And I wasn't positive in that moment. And that moment was kind of a breaking point for me, like to realize I have to do something about this because I can't live this way. And my family saw me like that. My husband saw me like that. And it was traumatizing for them. And that wasn't the only time I felt that. But we are such complex animals. Humans are so complex. So I think about it now, and those moments where I wanted to die, they don't define me, because I had other moments where I felt, so in love or so supported. They're just kind of fleeting moments of time. So the emotions that we experience, they are physiological responses that shift and change, and our emotions don't define us. So we can experience those things and say, yeah, that was a fleeting moment in time. I experienced that and I'm not ashamed, but I can also tell you that wasn't my personality. That wasn't me. That was an emotion. That was how I felt in the moment. So I do think that experiences like that were very eye-opening for me to know there's got to be another way. I have to figure out a way to kind of get through this because I don't want to live like this. And so something that ended up helping me when I learned about brain retraining, and something that I work with through my clients now, is when you have those moments of despair, because we all do, whether you have a chronic illness or not, we live in a world where we experience trauma on pretty much a daily basis. And life is always going to happen. But what I do now and how I live my life now is I've got these tools, and it's like I've built this armor within my nervous system so that I can respond in a way that feels aligned and feels good to me when life does happen, as it inevitably will. So in those moments where you do feel that despair and you do feel just terrible, something that I love is having a little anchor item, I call them. So a little rock or a little shell or a little I've got a little pine cone, little tiny pine cone that I have sitting here that I found in Ireland because my husband's from Ireland. And anyway, found it one day. I've got this little tiny pine cone. So something that is small that you can hold onto and keep with you and stick in your pocket, put on your desk, has a little bit of texture. And when those moments occur, grab that anchor item that will anchor you to this moment in time. Hold it between your hands, put it kind of back and forth between your hands, or just hold it. Bring your focused attention on it. So look at it. Take a couple deep breaths if you can, if that's possible. But what I really would like you to do in this moment is ask yourself, what is possible for me? What is possible for me? And maybe you can't even answer that in the moment because you're feeling so depressed and so sad or so in pain. But even asking the question, you brought up neural pathways. The thoughts that we have do take neural pathways in our brains. And the more we have that thought, the stronger the neural pathway is. And neural pathways are these connections between basic brain cells. And when we have a thought, and that thought kind of becomes a belief, that neural pathway gets stronger and stronger. But something that's interesting that happens is when we're having an emotional reaction, say, and maybe the thought pops up like it did for me, I just want to die. Well, maybe I had taken that or had that thought a couple of times, and that neural pathway had become stronger and stronger. Being able to grab onto something, put your focused attention on it, ask yourself a different question that can help you to totally change your perspective of the situation. What that does is slowly prunes away that old neural pathway associated to that thought, I just want to die, and creates a little bit of a new neural pathway. What is possible for me? Well, maybe what's possible for me is me to hold this anchor item and sit here and count to 3 and breathe in, and count to 3 and breathe out. Maybe it's possible for me to scoot my butt to the wall and put my legs up the wall and kind of naturally go into this pose that helps to kind of trigger that parasympathetic rest and digest response. Maybe it's possible for me to get up and go outside, take a couple deep breaths. Maybe it's possible for me to use a mental exercise that just takes about 4 minutes to run through to break this state. Then, when you figure out what is possible for you and you create that possibility and you partake in that possibility, that thought process, that neural pathway becomes less and less strong. It becomes weaker, right? And this new neural pathway becomes stronger. This one associated to possibility in my weakest and times where I feel the most powerless and just terrible. I think of possibility, and that becomes stronger and stronger. And then in our lives, our reticular activating system in the brain starts to look for events in our lives and things in our lives and people in our lives that align with possibility. And that cycle gets created. Well, now we're kind of consistently breaking this fight or flight response, this stress, this negative feedback loop. And so it's about doing that again and again and again. So that's the anchor item. I highly recommend that, asking yourself that question, what is possible to me? And one more thing that I'll add is when you can find purpose in pain, it makes all the difference. And even if you don't know what that purpose is yet, knowing that that is an option, creating purpose in pain. And then you start to look at your situation not as permanent, but as something that you can utilize later to help others or connect with a higher purpose or do something bigger than yourself.
I think I need to find I need to find a little anchor. I'm looking on my desk at the moment to try and see if I'm gonna try and find something after this call. What would be your advice to someone right now who's maybe at that point that you were at, where it might even cross their mind, like, I want to die? What would be your advice to them? There would be a lot of people listening to this who maybe are at that stage right now. What would be your advice to them in order to kind of like keep going, not necessarily from a practical point of view, but more from a mindset point of view?
Well, I like to lead with the practical. So if you look at that from a practical perspective, 90 seconds is the lifespan of an emotion. That means if you have an emotional experience or you have a thought that's intertwined with grief and sadness and despair, if you don't attach a story onto it, meaning you don't give that emotion meaning. So I'm sad, and that sadness is because I'm sick and I've been sick for years, and then you kind of go down that rabbit hole, right? We've all been there. And it's okay that we go there. But if you want to just reframe what's going on and look at this from a different perspective, experience that sadness, cry into that pillow, cry on your partner's shoulder, cry or scream or yell or get angry. But do it for 90 seconds. And at the end of that, if you're not attaching a story onto it and giving that emotion meaning, that emotion in the form of a physiological response goes away. Emotions are temporary. So allow yourself that. And so to go from that practical perspective to more of, a personal perspective, knowing that emotions are temporary means that you're not defined by them. And there is always another way. There's always another tool, another support system, another person, another moment in time that can absolutely change your life forever. It happened to me. It happened to most people who are interviewed on this podcast, and it can happen to you. And it only takes a moment, a second, and your entire life can change. So there's no reason to give up, because one moment, no matter what age you are, can change your life forever.
I think that's just we've got the clip that I'm going to post on Instagram to promote this episode there. That was
that was it.
That was it. I love that. I just, when you said there was always another way, and I think that's always something whenever I see that someone's got better or someone's done something, in my mind, there's only one way to do that, when in reality, there are so many ways to get to a certain point. There's so many ways to skin a cat. And I just think that in itself is a switch in thinking, to think that there is always a different way. There's always going to be another way. There's always another way out. And I thought that was really interesting. Is that something you've always thought, or is that something you picked up through, what you've been doing?
Well, I think it probably that belief for me probably stemmed from childhood. Like, I experienced abuse as a child. And when I did, I think part of me created this belief that I had to be strong, that I had to figure out a way, that I had to do something different, and I had to stick up for myself. And so this belief, even though it formed from, traumatic situation, I think, I'm not attached to a bad or a good belief in any way, shape, or form. I think it's a neutral belief. but I think it has helped in a lot of different situations. So I think seeing a different way and advocating for myself and figuring out a way out of that situation really helped me. And that just stuck with me. And I chose to believe it. Now that I have awareness and I've shed some light on that belief, I can also know that sometimes it's not helpful. Like when I, find weakness in myself, that's not a bad thing. Being vulnerable can be a strength. These types of things that I've had to disprove through the years. But yeah, so it is kind of natural. And something I wanted to point out too, Phil, is that you look at what you're doing. And you're so funny because you're like, sometimes I get so caught up in thinking that there's one way. But I think this whole other side of you knew that there wasn't just one way. That's why you're interviewing people. That's why you're seeking. That's why you're talking to people. And so, I know we talked about this earlier, but this does fulfill one of that purpose, that kind of you seeking purpose side of things. But at the same time, it broadens and expands your horizons every day. And whether you know it or not, you're keeping track, whether if it's just in a conscious way or subconscious, I'm not totally sure, but you're keeping track of the different modalities, of all the things that work for other people. And that's what's so cool, I think, about the brain. And how we make choices and who we are and the beliefs and all of these things. Not one belief, not one action, not one thought will ever define you. We are complex. And when we know that and we get to kind of know ourselves, I mean, that's just a huge game changer. And we can really, find all of the different types of purposes and different parts of us that we are. It's a beautiful thing.
Definitely. And it's really interesting. You this guy that I met on a retreat like recently messaged me yesterday, just being on an NLP course somewhere in Europe. And he was just like, this whole week has changed my life. You need to look into this. So I was like looking into it, and then you bring it up on this podcast today. So I'm a big believer in like when things like come up a few times, you need to like pay attention to them. Like the universe is trying to tell you something. So thank you for coming on and sharing all of this. It's it's been amazing. If anyone wants to reach out to you to ask any questions or potentially work with you, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah. So on my Instagram, I have a lot of free tips and tools and videos, things like that at my Vital side. And you're welcome to kind of check out what I have on Instagram. And my website is vital-side.com. And that's where I have all my programs, my membership program, which you can start today, information about private sessions, group calls, things like that, all on the website. But first and foremost, there's this incredible video. It's about 35 minutes long, and it kind of goes deeper into my story and then talks about how I use brain retraining to heal in, if you can imagine it, more detail than we talked about today. So that's a good place to start, and it'll kind of give you a good overview for how brain retraining works and how you may be able to apply it to your own life and your own healing journey.
Awesome. I think you'll get a lot of people checking that out for sure. I know I will be. Look, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time. I know you're busy, and I'm really excited to get this out there to people, because I know it's something that people really need to hear. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.